Okay, let's unpack this. Forget what you thought you knew about geek culture maybe being this fringe thing.
Yeah.
Because these days, massive superhero movies, these huge video game worlds, conventions with like hundreds of thousands of people,
Mhm.
it's absolutely mainstream.
It really is. What was once kind of hidden away is now completely front and center.
Totally.
And it's a huge cultural shift, right? Which brings us to the real question, I think. Why?
Exactly.
Beyond just, liking the movies or the games, why do people dive so deep into these specific worlds? What's the psychological stuff driving that engagement?
Right. And that's why we're doing this deep dive, isn't it? We want to explore the psychology behind why people get involved in what we're broadly calling geek culture.
Mm-hmm.
And we're basing this on some pretty solid research you brought to the table.
Right. The source material is this comprehensive research paper titled A Psychological Exploration of Engagement in Geek Culture.
Okay.
And what's great about it is the scale. They didn't just do one study. They ran 7 different studies.
7.
Wow. Yeah, involving over like 2,300 participants to really dig into those psychological drivers.
Okay, 7 studies, 2,300 people. They were definitely trying to get some real answers. So based on that work, what were the main sort of ideas they were testing? What were their theories about why people get involved?
Well, they basically proposed 3 core theoretical reasons. First, this idea of escaping reality for a fantasy world, maybe seeking something that's hard to find in daily life.
Think so.
Second, the fundamental human need for belonging, for social connection,
Yeah.
finding your people.
Okay.
And third, this desire for active engagement and creativity, seeing geek culture as a place for doing stuff, not just passively watching or consuming.
Okay, so escaping, belonging, and active creation. Those definitely feel like powerful human motivations. Before we dive into what the study actually found, maybe we should clarify what they meant by geek culture and how they measured it.
Yeah, absolutely. Good idea. So the study talked about geek culture as basically a subculture rooted in enthusiasm for things like Japanese animation, science fiction, video games. But they definitely acknowledged it's moved way into the mainstream now.
Which is just the world we live in, right? It feels kind of universal sometimes.
Exactly. And they included activities like role-playing games, think D&D sessions,
Mm-hmm.
comic books,
Yep.
cosplay, dressing up in costumes and going to those massive conventions like Dragon Con or Comic-Con.
Right.
And a key point they made was that within these communities, showing off your knowledge or your devotion to this stuff often becomes a kind of social currency.
Ah, okay. So it's not just about passively liking something, but being an active participant, maybe showing you're a real fan, maybe even an expert. That makes sense for building like identity and status within a group.
Precisely. Yeah. And to measure this engagement, put numbers on it, the researchers developed something they called the Geek Culture Engagement Scale, or GCES.
DCES.
So they built this scale based on the kinds of activities and interests you typically find at those big geek conventions. They wanted to capture participation in these sort of canonical geek interests.
So this scale let them basically quantify how engaged someone is in geek culture. That sounds like a crucial first step for doing research like this. Did the scale break down different ways people engage?
It did, yeah. Their analysis of the GCES found 7 related clusters, or sort of groups of activities. Things they called lifestyles, theater, hobbies, puppetry robotics, Japanese interests, sci-fi fantasy, and role-playing.
Interesting categories.
Yeah, and it's worth noting, they found the scale seemed to work best for people engaged in multiple activities, what they called generalists. They suggested that specialists, people really intensely focused on just 1 or 2 things, might show different patterns, which adds a nice bit of nuance, I think.
That's a really good point. To keep in mind, engagement isn't monolithic. Okay, so we've got the groundwork, defined, measured. Let's jump into that first big hypothesis, what they called the Great Fantasy Migration.
Right. So this hypothesis explores the idea that maybe people turn to geek culture, especially the fantasy parts, to feel good about themselves, right? To seek admiration or success, maybe when it's kind of hard to get those things in, real life.
Yeah.
And this line of thinking connected engagement to traits like narcissism, not necessarily like the clinical disorder, but narcissism as a personality trait.
So the idea is, if the real world isn't giving you the spotlight you want, maybe stepping into a role-playing game where you're the hero or becoming the go-to expert on a fandom kind of provides that feeling of importance.
That's the core psychological driver they were testing, exactly. So the predictions were that higher geek engagement would be linked with narcissism, also with fantasy proneness, that's like a tendency towards intense daydreams or magical thinking,
Okay.
and potentially maybe less engagement in typical real-world goals or civic stuff.
Okay, so what did this study actually find? Did this fantasy migration idea hold up?
Well, on the narcissism link, they found really strong support.
Yeah.
Across multiple studies, different samples, even when they controlled statistically for things like age and gender, there was a consistent, significant positive relationship between geek engagement and grandiose narcissism.
Okay, hang on. Grandiose narcissism.
Yeah.
How's that different?
Good question. So think of it as the more confident, maybe sometimes arrogant type. Someone who seeks admiration, feels kind of superior. It's distinct from vulnerable narcissism, which is more about insecurity and needing reassurance.
Gotcha.
And the study found the link primarily with the grandiose type. And this connection was strongest for those more immersive GCES factors like lifestyles, theater, role-playing, puppetry, robotics.
That fits?
Yeah, it fits the idea, right?
Mhm.
If you're seeking validation through performance or really deep immersion in an identity, the link wasn't quite as strong for the hobbies factor, and vulnerable narcissism didn't really show a consistent link across all the analyses they did.
Wow. That's quite a striking finding that seeking admiration or feeling superior might be a psychological thread linking to deep engagement, especially in those performance or immersion areas. What about the fantasy and immersive traits side of it?
Yeah, they found support there too. Geek engagement was positively related to fantasy proneness, which makes sense,
Right.
and also traits like dissociation and schizotypal personality traits. Now, the study authors do note that these latter two traits were also found to be linked to creativity, which we'll get to later.
Okay.
But the connection to fantasy proneness definitely aligns with the idea of finding appeal in these rich internal worlds and imaginative scenarios.
Okay, so definite links to certain types of narcissism and to traits associated with vivid imagination, maybe non-traditional thinking. Now, the third part of that hypothesis were geeks actually checking out of real life.
This is where it gets really nuanced. And honestly, it kind of flips a common stereotype on its head.
Mm.
So the study's own GCES scale had an item about real daily life. And yes, higher geek engagement did correlate negatively with participation in that specific item.
Meaning people highly engaged in geek stuff perceive themselves as less engaged in that.
Right. But the authors, quite wisely, I think, questioned if that just means they define their real life differently.
Right, maybe their real life includes their gaming group nights or planning for the next convention or their online community.
Exactly. So what happened when they looked at more concrete things like life goals and civic behavior?
Yeah.
This is the really surprising part from their study 3. While they did find less engagement in areas like traditional political behavior, like voting and goals focused purely on family life,
Yeah.
they found more engagement in other areas. People with higher geek engagement were more engaged with goals related to power, status, career advancement, activism, artistic pursuits, and participation in many non-political civic organizations.
Wait, hang on. So less involved in maybe traditional politics or maybe purely family stuff, but more involved in their careers, art groups, neighborhood associations, even activism.
Exactly. It's not disengagement from real life across the board. It looks much more like a redirection of their energy and interests into different avenues.
Wow.
It completely challenges that old stereotype of the disengaged hermit in the basement, right? They might be building a career, organizing community art projects, participating in activist groups, all while being deeply engaged in their fandoms.
That is a crucial distinction. Okay, so the great fantasy migration hypothesis. Strong support for the link with grandiose narcissism and aversive traits. But the checking out part is way more complex. It's more a shift in where energy is directed, not a total withdrawal.
Precisely.
Okay, let's move on then. The second major piece of the puzzle, the belongingness hypothesis.
Right. This one centers on that really fundamental human need to feel connected, to feel accepted.
Finding your tribe.
Exactly. Finding your tribe. The idea is that in a world where maybe traditional community structures are weaker or more fragmented, shared interests, like the ones in geek culture, can provide a really powerful basis for forming relationships.
Finding the people who get you, right? Who share your passion for things.
Yeah.
Maybe others find a bit weird or obscure.
Precisely that. So the predictions here were that engagement would be linked to expecting acceptance from others for these interests, and that it would actually result in forming closer social ties with people who share those same interests. That's what social scientists call homophily. Birds of a feather flock together.
Right, homophily. So what did the study find about belonging? Was it just like a hope for connection, or did they actually find evidence of real social ties?
Well, study 4 gave strong support regarding that expected acceptance piece. The more that participants felt that important people in their lives would accept them for doing a geek activity,
Okay.
the more positive they felt while doing it, and crucially, the more often they actually did it. For most activities, anyway. And this expectation of acceptance also correlated with a stronger self-identification as a geek on their separate geek identity scale.
So believing you'll be accepted actually fuels both your feelings and your behavior. That makes a lot of intuitive sense for social motivation.
It really does. And then study 5 used social network analysis to look directly at people's social ties.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. And the evidence for homophily was very strong. People who identified as geeks were significantly more likely to have other geeks in their personal social networks.
Okay, not surprising, but good to see it confirmed.
Right. And even more specifically, they found what's called focal homophily, meaning people who shared specific interests, like role-playing, were much more likely to have other role-playing friends in their network.
Ah, that's powerful. So it's not just finding a community, but finding a community based on the specific things you love, like
Yeah.
quantifiable proof of finding your particular tribe.
Exactly. It's pretty compelling evidence for that aspect. Now, the study did note one interesting bit of nuance.
Mm.
In study 1, they didn't find a direct link between geek engagement and measures of fulfilled relatedness needs.
So just because you're involved doesn't necessarily mean all your social needs are perfectly met already. Maybe it's more about the seeking and the finding of connection.
That's exactly how I read it. It suggests that the motivation to seek acceptance and the actual outcome of forming these interest-based social ties are key psychological drivers of engagement. It's not necessarily that geek culture is something people only turn to after all their belongingness needs are completely satisfied somewhere else.
Right.
It's more about the active process of building those connections.
That adds important depth. It's not just a static state, it's an active pursuit of belonging. Okay, so we've looked at escaping or validation, and we've looked at belonging. What about the third big idea, this desire for engagement?
Right. This hypothesis proposes that geek culture appeals to people who don't just want to be passive media consumers. They want to be active participants. It's seen as a space for stimulation, challenge, creative outlets.
Like, building super complex Lego sets based on a franchise, or writing fan fiction, designing costumes, making up house rules for a game, that kind of active creative energy.
So precisely, all of that. So the predictions here were that engagement would correlate positively with traits like need for cognition, which is basically enjoying effortful thinking,
Okay.
sensation-seeking, openness to experience, and also measures of intelligence and creativity.
So the general idea was maybe this deep engagement is driven by a desire for intellectual stimulation and creative expression.
That was the prediction, yeah. And they found very strong support for links to creativity and openness.
Ah.
Yeah, geek engagement showed really consistent positive relationships with openness to experience across multiple studies. And it also strongly correlated with various measures of creativity in Study 7, things like creative behavior, ideational behavior, which is about generating ideas, and positive attitudes towards creativity.
Okay.
And geek identity itself was also clearly tied to creativity.
That absolutely rings true, doesn't it? Given how much creation happens within geek culture. What about the stimulation and intellectual traits, though? Need for cognition, intelligence.
Yeah, this is where the findings were more mixed and honestly had some surprises.
Oh.
Well, sensation-seeking showed an initial link in one study, but it didn't really hold up consistently when they controlled for other factors. And need for cognition, that enjoyment of thinking, it was actually unrelated to geek engagement in this study.
That's really unexpected. You'd kind of assume that getting deep into complex fantasy lore or intricate game rules would require and maybe appeal to someone who enjoys thinking hard.
You might think so, yeah. But the data in this particular set of studies didn't show that direct link. And here's the other really surprising finding. In Study 6, geek engagement was negatively related to both fluid and crystallized intelligence.
Wait, natively?
Yeah, as measured by their specific tests, which were things like vocabulary and pattern recognition.
Negatively related to intelligence. Wow. That definitely flies in the face of stereotypes, doesn't it? Both the positive ones and the negative ones.
It absolutely does. And the study authors themselves acknowledge this is unexpected and really requires more research. They're careful to point out that the specific intelligence measures they used.
Like a vocabulary test.
Right, exactly. Things like that might be influenced by stuff like verbal ability or educational background, and maybe don't capture the whole picture of cognitive capacity, or perhaps different types of intelligence that weren't measured here.
So the study did find this negative correlation with those specific tests, but the authors are basically saying, hey, let's be cautious about interpreting this as geeks are less intelligent, and it needs more investigation.
Exactly. That's the takeaway. It's an intriguing data point. It challenges assumptions, but it definitely needs to be understood within the context of the specific tests used, and
Yeah.
definitely warrants more research. What seems much clearer from testing this third hypothesis is that creativity and that appreciation for novelty openness appear to be stronger, more consistent psychological drivers of geek engagement than, say, a general need for intellectual stimulation or these particular measures of IQ.
Okay, wow. We've journeyed through all three of the study's core hypotheses now. The great fantasy migration, the belongingness hypothesis, and the desire for engagement. When we pull it all together, what kind of picture emerges about why people engage so deeply in geek culture based on this research?
Well, it paints a pretty complex, definitely multifaceted picture. I mean, the study found compelling evidence linking engagement to grandiose narcissism,
Right.
suggesting that for some people, maybe seeking validation or self-enhancement plays a role, especially in the more performative or immersive activities.
Hmm.
Then there's really strong support for the fundamental role of belongingness. That seems driven by the expectation of acceptance and clearly leads to these quantifiable social bonds based on shared interests.
Finding the tribe.
Finding the tribe. And then there's robust evidence connecting engagement to creativity and openness, highlighting this drive for active participation and imaginative expression.
And that whole idea of checking out of real life.
Yeah, that proved to be way more nuanced than just simple disengagement, didn't it?
It really did.
While they saw some disengagement in specific areas like traditional political behavior or family goals, they found increased engagement in things like activism, arts, career goals, non-political community groups.
Yeah.
It looks much more like a redirection of energy and interest into different spheres rather than just a total withdrawal from the world.
And that unexpected negative link with those specific intelligence tests remains, well, a finding that challenges stereotypes but needs more research, like the author said, with caution about the tests they used.
Precisely. It's definitely not the most consistent or easily explained finding, certainly not like the strong links they found to creativity and belonging.
So, for you listening right now, how does this framework land? Maybe understanding these psychological drivers gives you some new insight into why you were drawn to the geek activities you love. Or maybe it helps you see the engagement of friends or family through a slightly different lens.
Yeah, I think it really moves us beyond that surface level, oh, they're just like video games, or they're obsessed with that show. It helps us appreciate that deep engagement is often fueled by really powerful, fundamental psychological needs and motivations.
Yeah.
Things like the search for connection, the drive to create, maybe a space for finding acceptance or exploring different aspects of yourself. It's not just about a casual preference for certain types of media.
Absolutely. This deep dive into the psychology of geek engagement, using this specific research as our guide, truly shows us that people connect with and participate in this culture for really rich, complex psychological reasons. They go far deeper than just, enjoying the source material itself.
It really offers a fascinating window into the individual human drives that are fueling what's become this incredibly influential force in our society today.
So here's a thought to leave you with. Considering these very psychological reasons, seeking belonging, expressing creativity, maybe even finding a stage for self-enhancement, how does knowing that change your perspective on the massive cultural impact that geek culture is having all around the world?